Hey guys, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live from Kharkov, Ukraine, where, well, there's this little war going on. And so it's very interesting. I'm joined here by Scott Ritter, that most of you know. He is the famous UN weapons inspector, and he is a military expert, and he has a very heterodox view of this war that has proven to be more accurate than most of the mainstream. And so we're going to get right into it because we're assuming that all of you who are here know what this is going to be about, which is the Battle of the Donbas, the famous cauldron that we've been predicting, everybody in the alt media has been predicting for the last few weeks. And Scott, why don't you take it away and just tell us where we're at with that battle and what can we expect into the future?
Well, let's just start off by saying that the concept of a looming um, double envelopment, so to speak, of Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region is no longer fringe military analysis. It's been interesting to watch the mainstream media as their military experts have been compelled by reality to admit that there there is going to be a decisive battle in the Donbass, and Ukraine is probably going to lose. Um, and that's a difficult, assessment for them to make after having bought into the Ukrainian notion that the Russian army had been strategically defeated and was a was in a retreat with its forces badly depleted. We uncertainty whether or not they'd be able to reconstitute, et cetera, et cetera. The fact of the matter is, we are on the cusp of the the beginning of phase two of the special military operation in Ukraine to achieve the stated objectives of the Russian leadership, which has always been the liberation of Donbas. When President Putin gave his announcement declaring the start of military operations, he made it clear that this was about the liberation of Donbas. He also made it clear that given the disposition of Ukrainian forces, the battle would have to be expanded into regions outside of the Donbas with numerous supporting operations. And we've discussed some of these. I mean, a key element of this entire conflict is the fact that Russia came in with forces that, doctrinally speaking, were inadequate to the task if you were viewing this as a conventional Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is, with the Ukrainian military able to deploy upwards of 600,000 troops on the battlefield, including regular troops, reserves, border guards, territorials, etc. A Russian invading force of 200,000 was operating, directly reverse of where it should be. Normal attacker to defender ratios of 3-to-1 are what you want, and Russia was attacking at a 1-to-3 disadvantage. But Russia wasn't carrying out your typical military, doctrinally adherent operation. Much of the Russian efforts were to shape the battlefield. In fact, all of Russia's efforts were to shape the battlefield in Ukraine to its advantage so that it could carry out a successful recapture of the Donbas. Key to this was the isolation of the bulk of the Ukrainian forces in the east. You isolate them by fixing them with a frontal attack. This was carried out in large part by the Russian militias or militaries of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics, supported by the Russian army. And then you likewise carry out diversion attacks or feints designed to hold other Ukrainian forces in place and divert resources to reinforce these areas. And this, of course, is what happened with the Russian feint on Kiev. And I call it a feint because anybody who thinks that 40,000 troops could capture a city of 3.1 million has been reading different military history books than I have. The same thing in the south, where a Russian amphibious feint combined with ground attacks coming out of Crimea fixed Ukrainian forces in the Odessa area and compelled Ukraine to divert reinforcements there. Then Russia carried out a strategic air campaign, which targeted the logistics, command and control, and some, but not all, of the strategic lines of communications of the Ukrainian armed forces, to the point that I believe. Look, let me give you a historical example. In the Gulf War, when we were getting ready to launch the ground attack against the Iraqi military, General Schwarzkopf had this giant map up on the in the command room, command post, and on it was each one of the Iraqi divisions. And green, if the Iraqi division was in green, it meant that it was at near full strength. Yellow meant it had been attrited down to 60%, and red meant it was attrited down to below 50%. And the feeling was that we would launch the attack when we got a certain number of the Iraqi divisions down to red, and then we could carry out. And this required, extensive aerial bombardment, probes by the ground forces, etc. I mean, we were shaping the battlefield, and we finally shaped the battlefield to where we believed it was, we could carry out our main attack. And in support of that main attack, there was significant redeployment of forces. For instance, we didn't send all our forces west early on, because if the Iraqis had picked up on that, they'd be able to shift forces. So we shaped the battlefield, and then when the time was right, we began to push west, and then we carried out our main attack. Something similar is taking place in Ukraine. Phase one was all about shaping the battlefield, pinning the Ukrainian forces down, and then attriting them to a level that would facilitate a future phase two classic maneuver operation. And this doesn't mean that they had to be down below 50%. What this meant, though, is that you had to degrade their ability to carry out effective coordination with other Ukrainian military forces. You eliminated their maneuver options by denying them fuel, and then you attrited them. You killed as many as you can. If you take a look at what the Russians are claiming, they've taken out the bulk of the Ukrainian armored force. So the main battle of Ukraine hasn't even begun yet, and the Ukrainian military has been attrited down to basically combat ineffectiveness in any other situation besides the static defense. The Ukrainians.
Yeah, by the way, I've noticed that a lot of the Ukrainians, they're driving around in civilian cars, which I'm assuming it's because their own military vehicles have been blown away, basically. Would that be an accurate inference?
That and hoping that the Russians won't attack civilian cars. I mean, when you
Sure.
you drive around at clearly a military target, you can get hit. If you drive around a civilian target, unless the Russians know what's inside the vehicle, they're hesitant to strike that vehicle, because that would be a violation of the law of war, which, again, I reiterate, Russia is assiduously adhering to. I mean, all this mythology of the brutality of the Russian forces, just an absurdity in the extreme. Is it possible that the Russians have inadvertently struck civilian targets that had no military purpose? Yes. Is it possible that a handful of Russian soldiers, in the heat of combat, let their anger and bloodlust get the better of them? Yes. But overall, from a global perspective, the Russian military has been assiduously adhering to the international humanitarian laws that govern combat. And
my thinking has always been that when you have 190,000 men invading another country, there's always going to be the chance that you're going to have a few psychos. I mean, it's inevitable. In any population of 190,000, you'd have crazy people, and crazy people with guns do crazy stuff. So yeah,
especially in wartime. Look, again, another war story from the past. I had a very good friend, Colonel Harry Tennell, and he commanded a striker brigade in Afghanistan. And Harry was the consummate professional. His battalion commanders were the consummate professionals. His company commanders were the consummate professionals. His platoon commanders were the consummate professionals. They were very well trained. They were supported by a very professional NCO corps. And yet, when his brigade went to Afghanistan, there was a platoon that had bad leadership, and they murdered several Afghans. And it became a scandal that stained the reputation of Harry's unit and the entire U.S. Army. But it's unfair to say that because you had a platoon go bad, go rogue. And by the way, this platoon was held to account. And they were arrested, and trials were held, and severe sentences were passed down, etc. It's human nature. I mean, when you have a city of 200,000 people, you're going to have some people who break the law. So
exactly. That's my point.
So now so now we come back
to pivot to is the following. See, the question I want to pivot to now is the issue of where do we go with this battle? How long do you expect it to last? Because as I understand it, it's going on now, is it not? And there's basically been an attack from Izium south. Is that correct?
Well, the war has never stopped. I mean, there's this concept that when we shifted from phase 1 to phase 2, that there was this pause in operations. My understanding is you reside in and around the city of Kharkov.
Yeah.
Has there been a day when you have not? Is there a day when you have not heard artillery shells?
No, not one. And actually, today it was getting louder and closer, and so I wanted to ask you about that.
but my point is that the war didn't stop. There, what people call a pause. Some units have been withdrawn to reorganize and reequip, which is totally normal. But the overall military pressure has been maintained because while the Russians are reorganizing for phase 2, they cannot let the pressure up off of the Ukrainians, or else the Ukrainians will reorganize for phase 2. And that sort of defeats the purpose of preparing the battlefield. So there's been this constant pressure, constant probing. And the Russians have something they call a reconnaissance in force. And I think that's what you're seeing in Izium, is the Russians carrying out a reconnaissance in force to find the ideal avenues of approach for the main attack. You don't want to, when the main attack comes, you don't want to punch into the heart of the enemy defense, or punch into an area that is heavily mined, etc. When this attack happens, it's going to happen with overwhelming firepower, and you might be hearing some of the initial artillery barrages in support of that now, followed by a steel mast fist that is going to be coming at great speed. And this is classic maneuver warfare. And when that happens, the last thing the Russians will want to happen is to run into a defensive barrier that they were unaware of, or have something happen that slows the momentum of their advance. So I think the battles we're seeing in south of Izium are classic pre-assault reconnaissance in force, meaning that it could be a battalion tactical group probing, finding weaknesses, etc. But when the moment comes, it's going to be far more than a battalion tactical group bearing down south. And the other thing I would point out is, it's not just going to be coming from where you're at. And I'll point out for you, I don't think the Russians are going to assault Kharkov.
Why don't you think so?
Because cities are a meat grinder. If your goal is, look, historically speaking, one of the great mistakes ever made by the Germans in World War II was to commit to a battle in Stalingrad when they had the Russians on the run. Had they bypassed Stalingrad, cut Stalingrad off, left a minimal force to invest that city, and then push on with their mobile forces in a maneuver war on terrain that was eminently suitable for that, the Russians, the Soviets, would not have much of a counter. But instead, the Germans committed to a fight in Stalingrad. It stalled their entire offense, and it sucked in all of their forces. So they had no more options. If the Russians are serious about enveloping the Donbas, the last thing they're going to do is get involved in a street-by-street fight in Kharkov, which would be 10 times worse than the fighting you're seeing in Mariupol right now. That's just an absolute momentum thief. So I think Kharkov is going to be hit with artillery, hit with airstrikes, and surround it. And then the Russians are going to bypass Kharkov and move on and seek to invest the bulk of the Ukrainian forces that are currently stuck in Donbas. And you'll also see but I'll say this: to surround Kharkov and to invest it is going to divert significant troops, which is why I believe that while the thrust from the north, which includes one of the great modern day offensive military formations in the Russian military, the First Guards Tank Army, I believe that from, if I were General Dvornikov, I'd be expecting a slower rate of advance out of my northern thrust, and my main effort is going to be from the south, which is why I think Dvornikov was given overall command, because he's from the Southern Military District. And
so let me just understand the overall scheme of things. You're going to have this battle at the Donbas that is happening now and has been happening, but it's going to start getting to a crescendo, a climax over the next few days and weeks. And let's just assume that this main army, Ukrainian army, as I understand it, there are about 60,000 men there. And they've already been chopped up into two pockets, and these pockets are in the process of being encircled. And once they are encircled, they will either be annihilated outright or they will surrender to the Russians. So that is more or less the outcome. Is that accurate assessment up to that point?
Yeah, the annihilated outright part is a lot more complicated than that, because I think, as the Russians are finding out, these guys have gone gopher, and the Ukrainians have built extensive fortifications throughout. And the good news is, it makes it easier to surround them. The bad news is, if they decide to fight and die in place, they're probably sitting on sufficient food and ammunition to put up a stiff fight for some time. And you're seeing that. Well, look at Mariupol. It's held out for weeks. And I don't believe that the Russians will, once they surround these people, they've taken away the maneuver. They can't maneuver. They're no longer a threat. Now it's just a matter of killing them. But do you want to do that in a way that increases your casualties, or are you going to be patient and slowly and slowly and surely just take out one position at a time, and minimize your casualties? And I think that we could, if the Ukrainians in the Donbas decided to die in place, that battle could go on for more than a month.
And do you think that there might be a moment where simply their nerves, the Ukrainian army's nerve, just breaks and it sort of like collapses and it's over?
I think what will happen before that is the political nerves of Zelensky will break. Already you see Zelensky giving interviews where he's conceding that there will be the loss of territory. I mean, he's now, he was vacillating on that, but now he's conceding this, because he understands what's about to happen. When this development takes place in the Russian Southern Military District and the Western Military District unite west of the Donbas, creating this cauldron, there is literally going to be nothing between the Russian military and the center of Ukraine all the way up to Kiev. And at that point in time, we're looking at, we're looking at a situation to face the French government in June 1940, when their militaries collapsed in the Battle of France, and the German army was, pushing towards Paris with literally nothing between it and Paris. That's when the French surrendered. And I think that's probably a situation that Zelensky's going to be facing, because, he has no option. At that point in time, I believe he will issue some sort of appeal for a ceasefire, and the surrender of his Ukrainian, the formal Ukrainian military. There may be nationalist battalions, Nazi battalions that decide to fight to the bitter end.
Well, yeah, that's the thing that I'm very concerned about, because as I understand it, a lot of extremist elements are surrounding Zelensky at this time. In fact, the leader of the right sector, a man named Yarosh, is quote unquote consulting the overall military commander of the Ukrainian forces. And as I understand it, he's actually the guy pulling the strings. And as I understand it, there's a great deal of pressure coming from Washington to, keep on fighting to the last Ukrainian. And so I understand your point of thinking that the political nerve might break before the military nerve. But what happens if Zelensky is put in such a box that he is simply unable to surrender? Because the right wing factions that are surrounding him have basically told him in previous videos, there are videos of this, that they'd kill him if he takes a step back. And his Washington masters, Victoria Nuland and that whole crowd, are insistent, adamant of continuing this because they see the fight between Ukraine and Russia as a long drawn out war of attrition. And so what happens if the political leadership insists on just going and going and going? Will there come a point where the military on the ground in situ just decides we're done and just throws in the towel, and there's like a split between the political and the military?
The short answer is yes. Look, history has shown that professional military organizations will fight as long as they can responsibly, execute a military operation that has some chance of success.
Mm-hmm.
But when confronted with the inevitable defeat, because military officers and military soldiers tend to be honorable people doing a very difficult job, they will, and they're usually doing this in defense of their own people. And if they look at a situation that says we're going to take a huge amount of unnecessary casualties, and the end result will be not only our defeat, but a worsening of the situation of the people we're entrusted to defend, that the honorable decision at that point is surrender. There's nothing dishonorable about that. And we've seen that. We saw that with the fall of Nazi Germany, where the German military in the end was seeking to surrender. We saw that more recently with Armenia in its conflict with Azerbaijan, where the military confronted the Armenian president and said, "Hey, we lost. We can't go on. If we continue to fight, it's going to be 10 times worse."
Yeah, so I see your point. So can I ask you the following question then? If you were overall commander of Ukrainian forces, seeing the battlefield as it is now, what would your decision be? How would you go about prosecuting this war and trying to win? What would you do?
Well, I would, first of all, I wouldn't have 60,000 of my finest troops trapped in Donbas. Um, I would seek to extricate as many of my forces as possible to a defense of Kiev, and to fight some sort of mobile battle westward, trading space for time against Russian casualties in an effort to wear the Russians down and try and get some sort of negotiated outcome where the Russians didn't have the reality of an overwhelming Russian victory. My goal would be to grind the Russians down to the point where they politically could not continue this fight, and then try to get as many concessions as I could from whatever surrender there would be.
But I understand your point of not having allowed yourself to be caught with 60,000 men trapped there. But if you were like airdropped in, if you were like magicked right into the middle of it at this time, is there a plausible solution to this military problem?
Well, again, I would seek to take those 60,000 troops and break out, and that would be disruptive of the Russian attack. And if I combine my breakout with a concerted counterattack, I could possibly have some minor encirclements of my own of a Russian division or something of that nature, which again created so many casualties and disrupted the momentum of the Russian attack that I might be able to get 40,000 guys out of Donbas, and get them into my main line of defense and incorporate them into into a classic mobile defense over terrain that is suitable to that.
But you'd lose 20,000 in that effort.
I'm going to lose 60,000. So, I'm going to take the 40. I mean, I do military math, man. I lost 60,000. They're doing nothing for me.
Good point. So, yes, because 40,000 is better than zero. Yes. Okay.
But the other thing I'd be looking at too, to be honest, if I were the military guy, is I'd be carrying out a night of the long knives. I'd bring in my special forces guys that I trusted, and overnight, every single neo-Nazi far right person surrounding the president would be arrested or killed. And I would arrest or kill the senior right-wing leadership, and I would tell the nationalist battalions, they either join me with discipline or we will kill them. Because these guys are the ones losing us this war. They might be able to fight heroically, but they're limiting my commander in chief, i.e., the president's options, and they're tying my hands as a military leader. So I would get rid of them. The other thing that does is that denazifies Ukraine in a way that you can tell the Russians, hey, we took care of this, and that blunts some of the political momentum of the Russian offensive. So, I'd carry out that kind of preemptive action as well. These Nazis are horrible, and I believe that the majority of honorable Ukrainian military leadership is opposed to them, recognizes the evil that they've brought, the harm that they've done, and it's time to lance the boil.
Yeah. Well, here's the next question I have. Is it? I understand this big battle is happening now as we speak, and one way or the other, these 60,000 men. I keep hearing different numbers. Is it indeed 60,000? Is that a reputable number?
I actually think that might be on the lower end.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
So well, look at Mariupol, where we're finding out there's a hell of a lot more of them than we originally thought.
Oh, really? I have not heard that. Please explain.
Well, we were led to believe that that the majority of them of the Azov people have been killed, that the organized resistance, and we're down to pockets of hundreds, and we find out there's 3,000 to 5,000 of them dug into Azov steel.
Yeah.
That's a significant fighting force.
Yeah. Okay. I understand your point, but to go back to the line of questioning that I have is as follows. See, you have these 60,000, and they're essentially trapped, and they are obviously not carrying out the strategy that you are thinking, which is sort of like to, sacrifice a third of your force to pull out and retreat back to Kiev as a fighting retreat in order to consolidate at Kiev. That's not happening at this time, and so let's assume that those 60,000 men are trapped and they are neutralized one way or the other. My question is, after this battle, what can we see that will point us to the end of this conflict? What do you think are the next stages, militarily speaking, that would be logical or sensible from the point of view of the Russian military leadership?
Well, I think right now what we're looking at is phase 2, and what you're talking about is phase 3.
Oh, okay.
Okay, phase 3, I believe, is, unless the Russians know exactly how phase 2 is going to end, you can't really speak of phase 3. I think strategically speaking, the Russians will be prepared to carry out a follow-on attack with the goal of surrounding Kiev and threatening Lvov, and also surrounding Odessa. That basically you look at this giant arrow punching through the center of Ukraine, with 2 smaller arrows branching off to invest Kiev and threaten Odessa, and advance on Lvov. Why do I think that's the case? Russia just mobilized, they're in the process of mobilizing 60,000 reserves. Those 60,000 reserves, I believe, are not going to be frontline troops. I believe those 60,000 reserves are going to be used to secure the rear. while the battle hardened other forces move forward. You couldn't move forward with a big arrow like I just discussed unless you had rear area security forces in significant numbers. And if you leave yourself with 200,000 men, look at Mariupol. It takes 40,000 to invest that city. So you can't imagine a situation where you're going to have 60 to 80,000 of your frontline combat troops stuck in rear area security, and then try and make a major move on anywhere. So I believe the Russians are going to have to significantly reinforce, and that's why you see the mobilization of 60,000 reserves. These reinforcements will not be frontline forces because, frankly speaking, they're not ready for that. But they could be effective rear area security forces to free up these victorious, battle-hardened, and confident combat forces to make a major move. And again, once you start moving 60,000 armored forces through the center of Ukraine with nothing to stop them, and they're heading towards Lvov, that creates a whole new political reality for the Ukrainian leadership. Mm-hmm. And that's when I think you start to see Zelensky say, just like the French leadership did in Paris in June of 1940, that it's over and we need to bring this thing to an end.
Okay, so this big arrow heading west, can we say that it should be within the next 4 weeks, or is it going to be 8 weeks or 12? What time frame are we talking about at this time? What is your expectation?
I believe that this is going to be over sooner rather than later. I don't believe phase 2 is going to last as long as phase 1 because of all the preparation that's been done. And once the major offensive operations start, I see the battle being wrapped up in a week or two.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah. Because we are talking a new kind of warfare. We're not talking what occurred in phase 1. We're talking real, honest to God, Russian military doctrine being brought to bear on the battlefield. And we're also talking a Ukrainian military that's been prepped, softened up. We've been pounding their ribs, or the Russians have been pounding their ribs, so their hands are starting to drop down to protect their ribs, leaving their face wide open, and the Russians could come in with the haymaker and knock them out. The war's over. I mean, literally, my assessment is this war is over, except for the painful and bloody and awful necessary fulfillment of the final military objectives. But all the conditions have been created, put in place for a major strategic Russian military victory, the likes of which military historians haven't seen since World War II.
Yeah. There's another issue that I wanted to bring up. It seems very clear that NATO is getting exceedingly nervous. And in Poland, there's all kinds of crazy talk that is coming out of the high end of the political leadership of Poland. I mean, it seems that they're raring to go to get into a fight with the Russians, which seems... Kaczynski is the deputy prime minister, and it's common knowledge that he's basically the brains behind the Polish leadership, and he's the real leader of it. And he's talking about nuclear weapons for Poland. I mean, all kinds of crazy talk is coming out of Poland right now. Do you think that means anything, or is it just random desperation as the military reality of the situation dawns on them?
I think NATO has allowed the propaganda arm of Ukraine, the United States, Great Britain, and NATO to lull everybody into a false sense of complacency, to the point that they actually believed that Russia was losing the war in Ukraine. Now they are. I mean, they can read a map as well as I can, or better, because they've got better input. And I'm just telling you right now, there's not a single military professional in the world, when shown the map, the real map, where you can click on a unit and find out what its combat capability is, the fuel levels, ammo levels, morale levels, troop levels, etc. And you look at it, you're going, yep, boom, 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 boom. It's over. A 3-year-old could determine that outcome. And so now the Polish are waking up to the fact that Russia's about ready to win big, and NATO's not ready. I mean, NATO's sitting here talking about, permanently deploying troops east. That's not going to happen for a long, long time. General Walters, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, testified for the Congress the other day, where he said, they said, when are we going to get these for you? When are we going to know what we're talking about? He said, not till the Ukraine situation's over. They said, why? He said, because at that point in time, one, we'll know what kind of forces we need, and two, we'll know, who politically will support this. Because remember, America doesn't send forces over to Europe unless somebody invites them to. That means that somebody's willing to give them their territory, sign a standard of forces agreement, which cedes certain amount of sovereignty to American forces. They become de facto occupying forces, and then they have to pay for it. The day of America underwriting the bill for sending forces to Europe is over. So we're talking about a nation that's willing to take the political risk and the economic cost of receiving and sustaining American forces on their soil at a time when Europe is confronted with, a potential economic breakdown, collapse. Who's going to pay for this? How are they going to pay for this? So the Poles right now are looking at all this. There is no NATO unity. I mean, Poland just froze relations with Hungary. You can't speak of a unified NATO when you have two key Central Asian members of NATO not have frozen relations. Turkey's not a willing participant. Germany's showing cold feet. The Bulgaria is not really on board. Neither is Slovakia. So the idea that you have this unified NATO is absurd, and Poland knows the reality. So this is where you see the more nationalistic elements of any society, Polish or whatever, start to engage in the rhetoric of extremism. And the idea of a nuclear armed Poland is extreme. First of all, NATO, while the United States may may consider putting nuclear weapons on Polish soil, to do that as a NATO move would require all 30 nations saying yes, and that's just not going to happen. So now the United States would have to enter into some sort of bilateral relationship with Poland outside the framework of NATO. And now we're talking about upending, arms control, negotiating positions that have been rock solid for decades that justify why the NATO nuclear arsenal was not to be counted as part of the American nuclear arsenal. It would change everything. And I just don't see the United States throwing away decades of developed arms control position just because some Polish extremist nationalist politician is unhappy. I want to say this too. People need to remember this time last year, the notion that Europe is going to commit geopolitical suicide on behalf of Poland today because of what's happening in Ukraine is ludicrous. Poland is a nation that Europe recognizes to be an outlier when it comes to democracy, the values that Europe's supposed to hold on to, etc. Poland's popular now because they're on the front line. They're popular now because they've got Ukrainian refugees on their soil. But your European Union diplomat and educated government officials, they know the truth of Poland. They don't like Poland. So the idea that Europe's going to commit suicide for Poland is just absurd.
Yeah, I have a quick housekeeping note. There are over 9,000 concurrent viewers right now. Thank you very much, one and all. I hope you enjoy it. Also, to my Patreon subscribers, I just posted the link at the end of the show. The last 10 minutes or so, we'll bring on a couple of guests to ask questions of Scott. I ask you to please be brief, to the point. Get your question out so that you allow Scott to give us a full answer, and also allow for a couple of other people. Here's something else I wanted to ask you, Scott. Walter Mearsheimer, the celebrated historian and geopolitical thinker at the University of Chicago, who's famously outside of the Washington establishment, he is of the opinion that, and he said this just a couple of days ago, he's of the opinion that the United States, for political reasons, it simply cannot reverse course, because the sanctions are such that there is no possibility of reverse course on a political level, because it would cause too much damage to the Biden administration. And he is terrified that the United States is basically going to find itself sleepwalking into a war, a direct war with Russia. Do you think that that is a possibility, a realistic possibility?
I mean,
it's a hard
right
question.
now,
I know I'm putting you on the spot.
well, no, I mean, I don't want to give too flippant of an answer because, first of all, we're in an unprecedented situation. We're talking about a major ground war in Europe that people, 10 years ago were saying this is unimaginable. It couldn't happen. It's beyond comprehension. Well, it's happening as we speak. And it's one that puts nuclear armed Russia in opposition to nuclear armed NATO. Now, so far, the rhetoric of Polish nationalist extremists aside, there's no appetite in NATO or the United States for direct armed confrontation with Russia. And one of the reasons is that it brings about the possibility of nuclear conflict. We are hearing more and more in some of the more fringe military circles about the fact that they believe that if NATO would call Russia's bluff on a limited way, that Russia has no intention of using nuclear weapons. And to be honest, I believe they're correct, except that they're missing one aspect of it. Russia doesn't plan on losing that limited military confrontation either. And so if NATO wants to really, jump in the ring with, with the best, the best mixed arts martial fighter in the world, go ahead. The British are saying they're going to put a naval task force off of Odessa to threaten the Russian ships. They'll lose all the ships in a heartbeat. If you put any forces on the ground in Western Ukraine in a manner that hasn't been coordinated advance with Russia, you're going to lose. Look, I believe at some point in time, when this conflict comes down to the end, that Russia would be more than happy to allow NATO to put a humanitarian buffer zone in Western Ukraine, because the alternative is chaos, anarchy that would have Russian troops there, and Russia just doesn't want that, doesn't need that if they achieve their overall objectives. So I think that you're going to see there's just going to be these pressure valve on the sanctions. I think we're going to see that the issue of U.S.-Russia sanctions is going to be rapidly overwhelmed by the U.S. needing to pivot to China. I think the next big front, one of the dangers that the U.S. brought on itself by allowing the Ukraine conflict to become a conflict, because I will tell you right now, this is 100% the fault of the United States. 100%. We allowed this to happen. This war could have been.
I would argue that the United States goaded the Russians into this position.
Well, we did. I think that there's, it's one thing to sit there and have some, really old person, fat, in a chair, sipping whiskey, saying, the new Afghanistan. Okay, so there is that crowd. We're going to suck them into the new Afghanistan. There's another group that, cut their teeth on Russia of the 1990s and the early 2000s, and they haven't come to grips with the fact that today's Russia is just a completely different country in terms of confidence, in terms of willing to assert itself in their interests, who just didn't think Russia would ever do it, that Russia that wasn't going to pull the trigger. And I think, both of them were taken by surprise, because even the fat guy that talked about a new Afghanistan knew that was fantasy. It wasn't going to be real. And now Russia did it. But it's not just that. Russia broke the glass in the emergency box and pulled the lever of, we will defend our national security interests. China has a very similar situation right now with Taiwan, where the United States has built a coalition that is, seeking to defend Taiwan from being absorbed by the Chinese, threatening economic sanctions, threatening economic isolation. And it always looks worse in theory. But China's now looking at reality, thanks to the United States. Ukraine has occurred. Russia's going to win, and Russia's not being destroyed by sanctions. And China's looking at going, we got it, man. We can have Ukraine 2.0 right now in Taiwan, and there's nothing the United States can do to stop us. And the United States isn't going to get involved in a shooting war with Russia and Europe at a time when China is making big noise about going to Taiwan. I mean, I think Nancy Pelosi was making talks about visiting Taiwan. Soon we're signed a $95 billion weapons deal. The Chinese
that Pelosi visit seemed like it was a prelude to recognition of Taiwan, which would be, the red alert for China, as far as I understand it, right?
Well, her visit is a red alert. China's come out and said the mere fact that she's visiting is a red line. $95 billion. And the interesting thing about red lines is, again, people became accustomed to the United States establishing red lines and then backing away.
Yeah.
Russia made a red line on Ukraine and they didn't back away. And China's made a red line on Taiwan, and I don't think they're going to back away. So, the United States is going to find itself in a very difficult situation on both fronts, which I believe will mitigate against any, trend towards extremism in terms of American military response. The American military is not suicidal. They're realistic. I think that they would argue in favor of of being patient in a major military buildup before we ever thought about confronting Russia, because we're not ready yet. We don't have the forces in place.
Yeah. I'm extremely concerned about the possibility of escalation, and from my point of view, I want to have this end as quickly as possible. The neocons in the United States, the current establishment, call them what you will, they are convinced that in Ukraine, even if Ukraine army loses, the armed forces of Ukraine lose the war, that they can continue indefinitely with like an insurgency, sort of like in Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, you in another broadcast with somebody else, you discussed this, and you thought that would not happen in Ukraine. I have the same opinion, but I would like you, if you wouldn't mind, to repeat the reasons that you don't think it would happen in Ukraine to our current audience, and so we can discuss that point, because I think it's very. I heard your points. I thought they were very valid, and I want you to repeat them if you don't mind. I mean, I sound like I'm like, play your greatest hits, please. But that was a very cogent line of reasoning that you had on the insurgency or lack of insurgency in Ukraine, and I'd like the audience to hear it, please.
Well, the first thing is that Ukraine has a history of insurgency that failed. Mm-hmm. The whole Bandera movement is predicated on a failed resistance. They failed against the early Soviets. They failed against the Germans. They failed against the later Soviets. The third phase of the conflict from 1944, say, to 1954, cost Ukraine between 250, 300,000 people. That's a lot.
Right. Yes.
And they lost. And I think right off the bat that, it's one thing if you're building on success. It's another thing if you're building on failure. The other thing is Ukraine is I don't want to say fake country, because that's just being far too crass, but it's a country that has artificially cobbled together at a minimum of 3, but possibly more different ethnic cultural constituencies.
Yeah.
You have one in the West, and those are the ones that fought the resistance and were crushed, by the way. You have the Ukrainians in the center, who historically are not inclined to be violently resisting, and then you have the pro-Russian, the Russian speakers in the East and the South. So where is this resistance going to come up from? I think if you talk about the West, that's the most likely feature. But even in the best of days, in the resurrection, the far right wing has always been a minority. They've militarized themselves, and they've used the threat of violence to allow their hateful ideology to infect the entirety of Ukrainian governance. But that doesn't mean that it infects the entirety of Ukrainian society. So to have a resistance like this, as Mao said, the fish needs to swim amongst the ocean. But the ocean, in this case, once denazification is been completed through the destruction of the military forces and the hunting down of the leadership. And by the way, we saw it today. I don't know if you saw the news, but the Russians just killed a very senior Nazi. I think 5 kilometers south of Izium. They caught him. The Russian Special Operations Forces got him. They have a list. They're going after
Yeah.
them. They will all be brought to justice. So my point is, I don't think that the demographic map of Ukraine is conducive to this kind of long-term concerted insurgency. Are there going to be pockets of people that decide that they want to fight afterward? Yes, and they will die violently and instantly. The Ukrainian, the Russian intelligence services have mapped out Ukraine. They know all the people, all the addresses. They know all the communications. They know everything, and so they will not have a problem in hunting down, killing those who decide to resist. I think the CIA's, the storied, investment in training of a unconventional warfare capacity was purely a propaganda exercise. I don't think it's real. The reason why it's not real is that you wouldn't have 5 senior CIA officials commit treason by talking about it to the press. I think it was purely a propaganda exercise. There's nothing real about it. And I also believe that what are you fighting for? At some point in time, people aren't going to be fighting for the Ukraine. They've conflated fighting for the Ukrainian nation with what's really happening, which is fighting in defense of a hateful ideology. And I think once it becomes apparent that all you're doing through sustained resistance is fighting for a hateful ideology, that the impetus to carry out this kind of resistance would occur. But the Russians, I believe, are very good at this.
Yeah, it's also my thinking is that a lot of these the potential leaders of this resistance are currently in the regime at this time. The Banderistas, the right sector people, all of these, and the Russians, as you said, know exactly who they are, and they are going to target them. And so, even if the Russians do not capture them, these people are going to be on the run, and so they will not be able to organize any kind of viable resistance. And so, effectively, it'll be the same thing. In my own case, also living here, I live in eastern Ukraine, and my sense, and this I cannot prove it, it's just a sense that I get. The people in the East do not seem as particularly interested in pursuing any kind of quote unquote resistance. And also, I would point out that the people who have left are the more pro-Western, anti-Russian people. And it's obvious that there is going to be a Russian military occupation of most of Ukraine for a period of time. I would not be surprised if it's over, a year or two. And so I don't think that those people who would be very much opposed to the Russians, I don't think that they're going to return. And so therefore, I don't think that there's going to be a universe of people from which a resistance could draw members that could actively put up any kind of fight against Russian occupiers, if you see my point.
No, I agree. I mean, I just think that this is a fiction that's being created by the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian nationalists and their supporters in the West. Again, primarily to demoralize Russia. I think that's the goal, is to try and overwhelm the Russians with.
Let's turn to that for a moment, because a lot of people in the West, in the Twitterverse and all the rest of it, they keep insisting that the Russians are demoralized and they're stealing their own equipment and shooting each other and just all kinds of nonsense. But from what I am hearing from Russians in Russia, they're saying, let's get this done. And if we have to spend a year fighting, we'll spend a year fighting. I mean, what I'm hearing from Russians, granted, they are civilian and they are professional people and they're well-to-do, but the message I'm getting from them is precisely the opposite. And by the way, these are educated people who ordinarily would be very pro-Western, but at this time, they have the sense that, screw the West, let's get this done and take over Ukraine and be done with it. I mean, and this is from, like I said, Western-facing, English-speaking, and German-speaking Russian citizens. So what do you see in terms of morale, or more correctly, what signs or clues would lead you to think that the Russian soldier has bad morale or conversely good morale?
Well, we'll start with the second part first. The Russian soldier is very well trained. He's commanded by professional officers.
Hmm.
Um, that doesn't mean that they're perfect. Doesn't mean they can't make mistakes. It doesn't mean they can't be beat on the battlefield. I think we've seen that Russian military has suffered numerous tactical setbacks in Ukraine, primarily, I believe, through some assumptions that were made early on in the campaign that allowed their forces to be cut off, isolated, and destroyed by a very capable Ukrainian resistance. Let's just
Yeah.
we should
But
never ever forget that point. That Ukraine is putting up one hell of a fight.
Mhm.
But there's been this effort by the Ukrainian secret services and by their NATO allies to create the impression of a panicked, scared, ill-trained, ill-disciplined Russian force. And one of the ways they did that by leaking so-called intercepts of communications. Without getting into too much detail, I'll just tell you right now, as a guy who used to do this for a living, um, those are horrible fakes. It's Ukrainians pretending to be Russians using cell phones that cannot mimic actual tactical comms. And one of the reasons why is that the Russians are using encrypted tactical comms that the Ukrainians can't read.
Yeah.
And it's push to talk. Just imagine that if you're in a push to talk environment, how can you get two voices talking over each other at the same time? You can't.
Yeah.
So it's a clear fake. It's designed to achieve, you know, for uneducated audience in Russia to hear and start to worry and start to question. Now we move to the bigger picture. Let's talk about the Russian people first. And I can't speak on behalf of the Russian people because I'm not one of them. And whatever contacts I have contacts on both sides. I have people who are adamantly against this war. These are people that were primarily pro-Western to begin with, but they're not defeatist. They're not sitting there going, "Oh my God, we're losing." What they're saying is, "I don't like this war. We shouldn't be involved in this." Then you have the other people who are supporting this war, and they support for a variety of reasons. One, they bought into the Russian case early on, and they've been supporting this war from day one. Or two, and I think two is the majority. Russia has committed, and Russia must win. They're not going to quibble about this, that, or the other thing. It's Mother Russia is engaged in a life and death struggle. Mother Russia must win. And let's get this over. We've started something. Let's finish this. Let's do it. And I think the military falls into the number two category, if you want my opinion. I think if you had polled the majority of the military prior to this conflict in a poll where they couldn't have been held to account, I think the majority of them would have argued against a military operation in Ukraine because it just brings so many risks, near-term and long-term risks. But the military executes orders that it's given in a professional manner. Now, having committed, the military leadership will go 180 degrees out and tell their civilian leadership, we can't stop till the job's done.
Right.
Any half measure here is a military defeat. And as military professionals, we cannot have the Russian army being defeated. The Russian army must win and must win decisively. This must end in a decisive Russian military victory. And so we need you politicians, now that you've started this, to finish this. And I believe the Russian politicians are led by a Russian politician who is cut from the same piece of cloth. I actually believe that Putin didn't want this war. I think Putin did everything he could to prevent this war. And I believe that Putin was finally confronted with a series of events that made this war inevitable. And so he did it. But I think he's not one of these American politicians who second guess himself every day of the week. I think Putin said, do it, get it done. We're going to get it done at whatever cost. And not whatever cost.
My sense of Putin has always been that he's a very cautious man.
Yeah.
But when he has to move, he moves. He doesn't mess around. He doesn't dither. He doesn't second guess himself or his people. But he is very reluctant to take that big step until he's like, okay, we got to go. And he doesn't mess around. That seems to be the track record of the man.
And he's also I think his track record is he's not rash, he's not impulsive, he's not a gambler.
Yeah.
So when he made this decision to go into Ukraine, he has thought out the consequences. I mean, we keep having people saying that he was misled by his generals and all that. That's not who he is, and that's not who the Russian military is. I can readily buy into a scenario where the Fifth Department of the FSB thought that they were going to be better received by the Ukrainians than they actually were. And I can see where Putin would say, you know, we had bad intelligence, and that's why we got a bloody nose early on, because we went in with, with leading assumptions that didn't prove correct. But I also believe that Putin's the kind of guy that would have told his military, okay, let's say we cross the border and all these assessments are wrong. We get hit in the face. What do we do next? What's our plan? How do we recover from this? And you saw there was no let up in the Russian campaign.
Yeah.
They kept going. They adapted as necessary, which proves that this is mature leadership, leading a mature and capable force, implementing a mature and flexible plan.
Okay, I have an obvious question that I posted, I pinned up a little bit earlier of somebody who had very kindly sent a super chat, and they wanted to know if right now, if the United States decided we're going to go to war with Russia, could they do it? And let alone could they win against the Russians? I mean, if they decide to like go into Western Ukraine and start, you know, trying to eat up territory and go and fight the Russians, could they do it? And
what the forces currently gathered, the answer is they could probably push into Western Ukraine but maybe even reach Kiev. The Russians, have a considerable Ukrainian military. Pardon?
They have a home court advantage. I mean, Russia is right there.
Well, no, Russia, but the point is, this would be a short term. America doesn't have the force composition right now to do to sustain a fight. The majority of the troops that we have, the 100,000 troops, the vast majority of them are light infantry troops, airborne, light armored vehicles, etc. They cannot stand toe to toe with a Russian armored force. The American Air Force right now, has some airplanes in there, but they're not postured for sustained combat, meaning they will run out of ammunition, they will run out of bases, because Russia's not just going to sit back and let this happen.
No, of course not.
And then the other thing that will happen is the time it takes America to mobilize and send forces over to Europe is a longer timeline than what it takes for Russia to mobilize and send forces westward. So Russia has many advantages. And I think that this, if NATO moved into, or the United States moved into Western Ukraine, that fight would be over in a couple of months, and the United States would be confronted with a situation where, Russian troops were on the border, the Polish border with Germany, and the Baltics were gone, and
an ugly situation for the United States if it were to actually decide to turn on NATO and go to war with Russia.
Right now.
Okay.
Now, if the United States, again, if I were an American military leader, I would say, to Biden that we need to reactivate 2 armored divisions, and we need to send those 2 armored divisions over to Europe full time with all of the ammunition, fuel, logistics, everything permanently in place. And then we need to spend a couple years, training with a rejuvenated German military, Polish military, because the Polish military right now is incapable of meaningful offensive operations.
Sure.
They know that. They have to totally reconfigure themselves. That's an expense that the Polish people are going to have to pay in a post-pandemic economy, in a potentially collapsed European economy. NATO is not ready to do what you just said. NATO is not ready to carry out offensive operations into Ukraine because they will lose.
And realistically, it would be at least a couple of years.
Absolutely. To have sustainable, trained, to have forces capable of executing and prevailing in the mission you just described, it would take years.
Okay. Listen, two housekeeping notes. Number one, or three housekeeping notes. Number one, we're over 10,000 concurrent viewers. Thanks very much, everybody who's listening in. I hope that you're enjoying the conversation with Scott Ritter. Number two, we've just crossed the hour mark, and Scott has some things that he has to do. And so we're basically going into his time allotted for the other activity that he has. And so I'm going to bring on a couple of, I'm going to bring on Danilo. And this is from Patreon because I promised my Patreon supporters that they'd be able to ask Scott questions. Guys, if you ask Scott a question, please be brief, to the point, and respectful. Thanks very much. Danilo, go ahead. Do you hear us?
Yes, thank you. How you going, guys? Just a quick question. Assuming that Ukraine is split into by Russia in the near future, how do you see the Newland faction and the PNAC faction reacting to that? I mean, wouldn't that just send them off the deep end?
There's no doubt that there's and you've hit on a very important point that a lot of people ignore in this discussion, which is the degree to which Ukrainian nationalists have embedded themselves politically here in the United States. There's huge Ukrainian American organizations that their lineage goes straight to the Bandera movement. They're one and the same, and some of them are very, very influential and very, very intermeshed into American politics. Alexander Vindman, for instance, the lieutenant colonel, he's engaged in. I think the Chalupa people are also engaged in this. They're very influential. Newland is engaged in this, and they will, of course, go off the map. But understand that they are peripheral players. They're not the primary players. At the end of the day, the people that are going to make the call here is the Pentagon, together with the National Security Council and the President of the United States, because we are now getting into existential national security issues where the Newlands of the world work where they can create chaos and they were very successful, for instance, in Maidan. Maidan didn't cost America anything, and we got a lot of advantage out of Maidan. But any attempt to react militarily to a Russian military victory now brings in the Pentagon, and they're not playing the same political game that the pro-Ukrainian group is. So I think that you're going to see that they will be marginalized, pushed to the side, silenced, because they're no longer competing.
Right?
Say again?
They are very similar to they're pretty much the Zionist faction, as in the Israeli faction that were behind the some of the Banderites within the Ukraine now, but also historically as well. They're pretty influential in the US regime and foreign policy, right?
They're influential on the periphery. They're not, that this is like saying that a made man in the mafia is going to tell the inner circle of consiglieres what the Don is going to do. No, they're not in the inner circle. They're people on the periphery doing street hustle, but they're not the guys. They're not the guys in the Oval Office making the decisions.
Thanks very much, Danilo. I hope that Scott answered your question. Take it easy.
Yeah, thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks.
Cheers. My father's flock. How's it going? What's on your mind?
Good. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead.
How's everybody? So just curious, I'm calling from the United States, and I'm with you guys 100%. Actually, I'm Polish. I'm born here in the United States, but my parents and grandparents are from Poland, and they have some issues with Russians.
What's your question?
Oh, my question is, so how do we approach this as if the United States, like Mexicans, would come over the border and start flying their flag and not wanting to assimilate? How will we approach Ukrainians and Russians in that manner?
Coming to Poland or coming to the United States?
United States, like Mexicans not wanting to assimilate and become Americans. They want to take over California and Mexico.
Well,
how will we approach that?
I think the United States has to adhere to its laws. we are a melting pot. We've historically we're a nation of immigrants. That's not to denigrate Native Americans or first Americans, first people. And it's not to pretend that slaves that came over were willing participants in this, in the making of the American stew. But we are what we are. We are a nation of immigrants, and we have laws that that frown on people trying to to create a separate cultural political identity other than the United States. I think the United States can do a better job of absorbing cultures, being tolerant, but we've done a pretty good job of that. If we receive a large Ukrainian population, again,
I don't really think it'll happen, to tell you the truth. I know that I'm pushing your patience, and like I said, we have over 10,000 viewers. And so that's terrific news. I want to ask you, what's the final point you want to leave? Because I know that you're busy, or I don't know if you can stay a little bit longer and we can continue this conversation.
No, I actually have the people who actually pay my paycheck are calling, so I have to answer that phone eventually.
Okay.
So what I'll leave is this: is that Russia started something that Russia's going to finish, and it's going to finish on Russia's terms. That's what people should take away. The West is quickly finding out that the propaganda that they sold the rest of the world on is dissipating, as all hot air does, and they're now dealing with ground truth reality. And you're going to see NATO, I think, in the European Union coming to grips with this reality in the near future, and it's going to shape their response. And I think their response is actually going to be tempered, meaning I don't see anything extreme coming out of NATO or the United States. I see more of a acknowledgement of just the hard truth.
Well,
I think
that's the thing I'm very worried about, because you see, I don't know if you know this, but I come from a finance background, and so I have a couple of people that I know that are attached to the Federal Reserve, and they were the ones who gave me the heads up that the Federal Reserve institutionally was adamantly opposed to any kind of sanctions against Russia in the lead up to this whole situation, of course. And they were lobbying as an institution. Every single economist, no matter how junior, all the way up to Jerome Powell, was going out there to Congress, to the White House, telling them, don't do sanctions. It'll be a disaster for the European economy and the American economy. And the Biden administration was like, yes, 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 yes. And then the Nuland faction, the Nuland / Hillary Clinton faction overruled the Federal Reserve, and they went ahead and pulled the trigger on this. The thing that horrified the Fed was the essentially defaulting on Russia's foreign currency reserves with the United States. I mean, that was horrifying for the Federal Reserve. They were just freaking out. And I know through back channels that they reached out to the Russians to tell them that this was not them. They were as horrified as anybody. But the point I want to make is that, see, the Treasury wound up, the Federal Reserve, and to an extent the Treasury, found itself in this horrifying position that annihilated American financial credibility and created all kinds of chaos for America, let alone for Russia. And so, because the Nuland, Hillary Clinton, Clintonista faction, the McCalls of the world and all that, McFaul, what's his name? The former ambassador to Russia who hates Russia. That whole crowd just overruled the Federal Reserve and elements in the Treasury, and they imposed these sanctions. Couldn't the same thing happen with the professional military at the Pentagon, in NATO, in Brussels, that they say this is a horrible idea? No, 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 no. And Nuland and her crowd get their way?
No, Nuland's a nobody. I mean, I know she's there. She says things. She speaks. Let's look at reality. Last fall, Nuland went to Moscow, and the Russians received her but mocked her, and she was totally counterproductive to this entire effort. She was followed by William Burns, CIA director, former ambassador, the master of back channel diplomacy. And Burns, the Russians listened to at the highest levels, and they responded to. And then Burns came back and gave his advice, which was, people at least listened to him. I think going forward, you're going to, one of the reasons why we're not seeing too much of William Burns is that William Burns is doing what William Burns does best, which is back channel diplomacy out of the public eye. And I think you're seeing those kind of discussions taking place through intermediaries or direct, whatever the CIA is using for their method of communication. But that he's the player. Nuland's not a player right now. She's out there playing the, taking advantage of, a media environment that is receptive to what she's saying for propagandistic purposes. But when the rubber meets the road, it's going to be the William Burns crowd that's going to be calling the shots, not her, because at some point in time, this war will end. And when this war ends, the West is going to have to figure out how to repair relations with Russia on terms that are acceptable for Russia. It's not going to be Russia yielding to Western demands. It's going to be the West yielding to Russia's demands. And I'm not saying, Russia's already divorced, has agreed to a divorce. So we're not talking about getting remarried. Those days are over. What we're talking about is child visitation rights. And and the Russians will, I think, be having the stronger hand here. And I think it's in the United States' interest to be able to visit the child, so to speak, to have some sort of economic connectivity. Europe will insist on it, and William Burns will be the guy that that is fronting the initial phases of that until we get a reconfigured Biden administration. I don't see many of these people that sold this war on the American people surviving into the second half of the first term of a Biden administration. And I don't see a second term of the Biden administration. So, Victoria Nuland's days are numbered. She's riding high right now. I absolutely. Jake Sullivan, that troika there, I think are looking at the exit door.
So thank you so much for that, Scott. I really appreciate this conversation. It was a pleasure. And hopefully next time we can do it longer, because it's just fascinating talking to you. And next time we'll bring on the boys from the Duran, perhaps, and some other people who are smarter than me. And it'll be
smarter than me.
It's kind of depressing to be the dummy in the room, but it happens. But still, you learn stuff, and I've learned so much from this conversation with you. And I hope that our listeners have also learned quite a bit. Scott, stick around. I'm going to end the stream, and I just want to say a couple of personal words before you go. And to everybody listening, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. And that's it. Take it easy.